Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppy. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. At my site, you can find my book, The Ninth Hour. It is the first book in a fantasy adventure series that doesn't have magic and is not set in a fantasy world. So that's a thing. Besides that, if you want to check out something for free, you can check out my serialized novel, One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet. You can check that out on my website. It is put out once a month in blog post form, and it is also put out as a podcast form. So besides listening to me talk right now, you can also listen to me read if you prefer that. So check both of those out. That is One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet is a crime thriller / revenge story. So those would fit kind of in the same genre. They're not the exact same genre. You could have a revenge story that isn't a crime thriller as well. So you can check both of those out at my site. We are going to go to the word of the week, and I'm going to try to say this correctly, but it's very long. So we'll see if I can do it. And if you're like, hey, you said that incorrectly, there's about 17 syllables in there's about 17 syllables in this word, so give me a break. All right, our word, and you can see it written if you're watching my video. Our word is floxinasa And let's just say that again. Floxinasa nihilopilification. And that is the act of deciding something is worthless, which it takes just as much time to say the word as saying that this is the act of something this is the act of declaring or deciding something is worthless. Actually, I think it's the act of deciding something is worthless, not something declaring, which is a little more nuanced, right? There's a little bit of nuance right there. I'm going to say it one more time. Floxy, nasa, nihilopilification. I've also heard it said floxy, nasa, nihilopilification, like as in, so I don't know all the pieces of this word, but you have the word nihil, so like nihilism, which means, which is like there's no meaning to anything. So that would be connected to this idea of worthlessness. There's another word I'm thinking of that is connected to the word nihilism. Maybe it's a Latin word from deep in my memory that I just remember for some reason. We're going to get right into the accidental essence because it's a, how would I say this? It's long and it might go 2 episodes. We'll see. I'm not sure. But this episode, I think I'm going to get through it. We'll see what happens. This episode, I'm going to be talking about routine, and I'm going to be talking about the importance of routine and how that affects your creativity, how that affects your productivity, how that affects your ability to write, and how it's an aspect of your life that you should create / have, because it is helpful not only to your own personal health, but it is also helpful to your writing as well, because this is a podcast about writing, even though I never talk about writing on the podcast. This is a podcast about writing, and we are going to connect this back to writing, but this is something you can apply to so many different areas in your life. One thing I've noticed, and maybe you've noticed in this as well, is when I run into something that is connected to writing, it almost always is connected to life in general or some other aspect of life. It's typically the case that it's connected to life. It's typically the case that's connected to creativity, but it's also usually connected to something more broadly, and that's kind of how my mind works. I always try to connect different things, and maybe I'm able to bring another different perspective to writing that other people can't. I really don't know. You can make that decision for yourself, but I always connect things to a bigger picture, and I think it's useful to connect it to a bigger picture, not only because it helps us remember, because if we understand something in a context, we understand it longer, we remember it better. But we also, if we understand something connected to other things in a bigger picture, I think we understand it to a deeper depth. Because if writing fits into, so writing is a piece of life, right? Writing isn't contextless. It has a context. That's what I'm saying. And because writing has a context, if we understand it in its context, we're going to understand it in a deeper way, and it connects to other things, right? Writing, as I talked about last week, writing, or was it last week or the week before? I think it was the week before. Writing itself is not if you just have writing without the content that you're writing about, it's pretty meaningless. I can write about something that has very little depth. I can write about something with very little meaning, and because it is connected to things that are meaningful, or maybe not meaningful at all, because it's connected to other things, it's not just this thing that's standing by itself. We're never dealing with just writing. It's the same thing with storytelling, right? Storytelling is, you can have a meaningless story. You can have a story that is nihilistic, right? It's not saying anything. You can totally write a story that isn't saying anything. And it's not always the case that stories that are saying something stories that have a deeper meaning aren't necessarily the best stories, but the best stories are ones that say something, if that makes sense. They're connected to our world, but they're not carried by messages in our world. Let me rephrase that. So the best stories are deeply connected to reality, though they might not be realism, as I've talked about a few episodes back now with realism and being realistic. Right, you might have a fantasy story that tells truth on a very deep level. Where was I going with this? You might have a fantasy story that tells truth on a very deep level, right? You might also have something that's set in the real world, and it presents things as if they were real, but it doesn't really tell the truth about anything, if that makes sense. But that makes an assumption. My perspective on writing, my perspective on storytelling makes an assumption that the best storytelling and the biggest truths are things that we aren't necessarily able to see or touch. But storytelling itself is just a way to convey ideas. Storytelling, if you take away the context and the content of stories, you can have very shallow things. And this is what seems to be happening from my perspective, and maybe I'm incorrect, but it seems to be happening when you commercialize stories. And I think that the place in which stories are commercialized the most is the movie business at this point. There are also certain, you probably see this as well with writers who are extremely big, right? There's writers who have gotten to a level of success and fame, and they've figured out that a certain type of story gets them money, it will sell, so they continue to write that same type of story. It happens a lot with writers who get stuck writing the same character. This doesn't happen with every writer, but writers who get stuck writing the same character and that character's been played out, those writers often come across in a way that is just the heart's gone out of it, if that makes sense. They write it and you read it, you're like, this isn't as good. There's not as much depth here. They just didn't work on it as much. The character's been played out. It happened. I mean, you look at shows that have run way too long, like The Simpsons. And stuff eventually gets played out, and the stuff you can do with that world and those characters, eventually you can't do anything else with it. You're just treading the same ground. And the reason why The Simpsons gets boring after a while and it isn't as good as early on, because of the fact, and you might disagree with me on that, of course, because of the fact that The Simpsons is written to have characters who don't really change. You could have change within a story, but it's not written to have this great character development. If you have an extremely long story, right? If you have 30 years and you're telling a story over a 30-year period, and your character goes from the character changes completely over that 30-year period and continues to go through different developments, you're going to be able to do more with that character than if you have characters who do not change. I can only do so much with Tom and Jerry, but characters in more complex shows and movies and books, I can do a lot more with them, right? I could probably write a book that centers on, I'm trying to think of characters. See, most of the time literature is almost dependent on characters changing. Shows like The Simpsons aren't, but if I wrote a book about The Simpsons, I'd write one book and I'd play out how that works, because those characters aren't extremely deep. There's a certain level of, they're all types of characters. They all fit into these little rigid spaces with the characters. But if you have Harry Potter, the character has a central core to who he is, but at the same time, he does grow and he does change, and he goes from a child to an adult throughout those books, which it gives more room. And you could say, I don't think it'd be as good, just because Harry Potter was a coming of age story in a lot of ways. You could take Harry Potter and you could extend that. Please don't do this, J.K. Rowling. You could extend Harry Potter another 20 years, right? You could take 1 year at a time, and it would probably be a snooze, and we probably would not like it as much, but you could do it. And it'd be more interesting than if I did that with something like The Simpsons or something where the characters are static. We are going to be talking about routine. Routine is something that is very important in your writing. And I know I just went off on a big, huge tangent about stuff, but I was on a roll and I thought it was useful information. I thought it was something that you could use, something that would benefit people. And once in a while that happens, and that's okay. Routine. So before we talk about routine, we are going to be talking about why routine is important. Well, I'm going to get into psychological aspects of humans, and this is applicable across the board to all humans, right? Unless you're comatose. This applies to pretty much everyone. So we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to talk about how these psychological aspects connect to you as a person, how that connects to your life, how it connects to your productivity, your contentment, essentially, who you are as a person, your development, being healthy, and then we're going to shift it toward the end into the writing creative aspect. So we're actually going to be talking about, I think it's really one dimension of humanity, but like I said, it is applicable to all people, but it's one dimension of humanity, and that is the dimension of engagement, if that makes sense. So we have this dimension of engagement, and this dimension of engagement is on a spectrum, as not everything is on a spectrum, but this is on a spectrum, and the spectrum of engagement it starts at, now let me think, which side would I be on? Wrong side. The spectrum of engagement starts at sleep, and it goes until the flight or fight response, right? It goes until this extreme fear. So you have rest on one side. Rest on one side. Everything is mirrored, and I don't like it. Rest on one side, and you have anxiety or fear on the other. Okay. With rest, right? With rest, you have your brain is not the most extreme state of rest. I would say is sleep, or maybe being comatose. I don't know which one is more. Probably the deepest sleep is more than being comatose, but I'm not sure about that because I'm not a scientist who measures the brain activity of people who are sleeping in comatose. But let's just say your deepest level of sleep during the night, if you're someone who sleeps. If you're an insomniac, I'm sorry, that stinks. No, it really does. Having insomnia is horrible. But what was I going to say? But on one side, you have the deepest level of sleep. Okay, your brain is not working very hard. Your brain's doing very little. There's brain activity. There's always brain activity, right? Even when you're asleep, but your brain is just not working as hard, as much as when you're awake, because for whatever reason we need sleep. It does something it helps us. I don't really, from what I understand, people don't understand why we need sleep still. Okay, so you have rest on this side, and your brain's not doing anything. You're not going to be able to be productive while you're asleep. You're not going to be able to be productive. You're not going to be able to be creative when you're asleep. You're pretty much not going to get anything done because you're asleep. This would be similar if you took sleeping pills and you were trying to stay awake. This is why you're not supposed to drive vehicles when you take certain medicine, because it makes you drowsy. Your brain just isn't functioning at the level you need to be to do that. Your mind is not working hard enough. Your mind is slowing down. You're not able to react as quickly. You're not able to process information as quickly. Try to take a test really early in the morning. You're not going to do as well. It's easier when you're actually awake to get certain things done. So that's one side of the coin. You are at rest, right? You are at rest. You have this complete sleep, which is a good thing at certain times, right? On the other side, we have the anxiety side of things. where sleep doesn't have enough brain activity, or there's not enough going on to keep you engaged. Anxiety is the opposite. There's too much. Your brain is too engaged. If you are trying to play, if you're a musician, or if you play sports at all, if you do anything that requires a lot of different things happening at once, if you're a musician, for example, and you're playing a really hard piece, your brain is fully engaged on what is going on with that very difficult piece. Anxiety is similar, right? But it's not productive. So if you're playing a really difficult piece as a musician, you're being as productive as you possibly can be. You're at a level that we want you to be. You're at a level that you want to be at that is very good, right? You're able to do this thing that's very difficult. We want to be able to do difficult things. But with anxiety, for whatever reason, and I'll get into that in a little bit, for whatever reason, your brain is fully engaged, and it's engaged in a way that is not productive, right? I've talked about this in the past, but when you have anxiety, there's so many things you are trying to deal with at once that your brain kind of shuts down. You can't think as well because you're distracted by that anxiety. And it's not even just distracted by that anxiety. I don't think you physically can process in the same way. I don't think you can physically think in the same way without tons of effort when you have anxiety, because you have this constant, you have this thing in your mind that's saying, hey, you need to deal with this, you need to deal with this, you need to deal with this. And there's different types of anxiety, and there's different levels of anxiety. But when you get to that extreme, you're all riled up, you're trying to deal with this thing. I like to think of it as your brain seizing up, but it's really that your brain is at capacity, right? When you're at the highest level of anxiety, your brain is at capacity. You physically can't deal with anything else. You mentally can't deal with anything else. So one side we have rest, one side we have anxiety. So rest, again, like sleep. We have watching TV. That's a low level of brain activity on the rest side of things. And then anxiety, when you worry about something. And the extreme side of anxiety, the extreme side of when your brain is all, everything's at capacity. Really, the extreme part of that is danger or fear, right? Anxiety is just a type of fear. Anxiety is a low-level fear that kind of bubbles in you, and if you come across something that you are extremely afraid of, you only can focus on that thing. It's very hard to do anything else. If you have a phobia, this will make a lot of sense to you, because when you come across, if you have a real phobia, when you come across that thing that is the object of your phobia, you are going to freeze up. I am, to a certain degree, less now than I was before, afraid of heights. And I had friends who we would go, every summer we'd go on the ski jump. And when I first went up there, I would go up slowly. I would not I would try to just distract myself from everything else. And when I got to the top, I would sit down and I would hold on to something. And then eventually I slowly broke that fear. I'm still afraid of it to a certain degree, but at the same time, I can go up things that are very high, and I can look down, and I can not fear, right? I went to Seattle. I was able to go to the Space Needle. They have a glass floor. I was able to look, and I was able to stand on the glass floor. Even when I was there, I had to inch my way out onto that glass floor, but once you realize that there's no danger to you, that fear starts to dissipate. But when you have a phobia, when I was in that situation where I was on extreme heights and I hadn't dealt with that fear as much as I had now, I would only be able to think about that thing, and my mind would be like a live wire, and it would just constantly be going over in my mind. There's this, because I would be registering it as, this is a danger, you need to deal with this danger immediately. Same thing, I have a friend who's extremely afraid of snakes, and when he comes across snakes, he freaks out, because his mind is like, this is a danger, you need to deal with this danger immediately. If you throw a snake or even a rubber snake at him, I don't know if he does now, but back then, he would swear at you profusely. He'd swear at you and be like, what are you doing? And then he'd flip out. And that happens in a lot of different ways. If you get into a car accident, this happens as well. If you get into a bad car accident, you can actually develop a fear pretty instantly, a fear to driving, where you just worry about stuff and you're hyper-vigilant. That's really the term that is used for things like this. You're hyper-vigilant of everything around you, which in terms of cars, being afraid of driving is probably a safer fear. It's probably good to a certain degree unless it interferes with your driving, because driving isn't a very driving is a bad thing. But when you are in fear, your brain is at capacity. Your brain is trying to deal with that thing. Your brain is saying, hey, this is going to kill you and you need to deal with it right now. And this is the only thing you need to deal with. And it's going to be pushed to the front of your brain, no matter whether it actually is a real fear or not, but that's how it's going to work. If you're afraid of public speaking and you get shoved out in front of people, your brain is going to be like, you're going to die. That's kind of how it is. It's like, you're going to die. So you need to either figure out how to deal with this or you need to get out of here right away. These extremes, to a certain degree, these extremes are out of your control. To a certain degree, right? They're almost completely out of your control. If you're asleep, if you're in a very deep sleep, it's really going to be difficult for you to wake yourself up. You're just going to have to wait until your body goes through the process of waking itself up. Certain external stimuli can wake you out of a deep sleep, right? So it's not out of the realm of possibility that something outside of yourself can wake you up, and you can prep and make yourself able to wake up at some point, right? We can set an alarms, but when you're asleep, you can't really do anything about you being asleep. When you are in extreme danger, when that fear kicks in, it's almost impossible to do anything else, okay? Almost impossible to do anything else. And there's a reason for that, because like I said, your body is essentially saying, your brain's essentially saying, you're going to die. You need to deal with this. You need to run or you need to fight. It's like the fight or flight response. Both of these extremes in terms of our daily productivity are not a good thing, right? There are certain situations where this type of response is probably good, right? So if a grizzly bear is chasing you down, you want to be able to either probably flee. You probably don't want to fight that bear, but you need to be able to respond to that. And this is going to kick in and it's going to be able to allow you to do that. But generally in our day-to-day living, both of these extremes are bad at the same time. We don't want to be asleep all the time. We don't want to be fearful. We don't want to have an extreme level of anxiety and fear all the time. The middle ground is where we want to live in our lives. And most of us don't deal with the outer extremes. Some people do. I'm trying to think if I've run into people who actually deal with these outer extremes. If you're agoraphobic, which is, I believe, fear of large spaces or fear of being outside or something like that. If you're afraid of being around people, maybe that's what it is, then that's going to be a fear you're going to have to deal with. And that's going to be a fear that constantly invades your life. If you have a sleep disorder where you're always sleeping, that's going to be something that constantly invades your life. Most of us don't deal with those extremes. And like I said, those extremes are almost impossible to deal with, right? If you're running from a grizzly bear, there's not much else you can think about it unless you're running from a grizzly bear. But most of us don't reach that point. So most of us can do something about what we are dealing with at the time, right? If you're tired, you can push through that tiredness to still do something. If you have a high level of anxiety, you can still push through that anxiety and think through what you're going to do to be successful at the end, to get stuff done. I am aware that anxiety I'm aware that both of these things can be crippling. If you're always tired, if you're always like, oh man, I'm just so tired, it can be crippling to you. If you're always worried, it can be crippling to you. It can stop you from doing things. But at the same time, we do need to develop a way to, we do need to push through, and we do need to find a way to get beyond those difficulties in our lives to actually be productive and live lives that we get, not just getting stuff done, but you get meaningful stuff done. You actually connect to people and different things like that. We're always focusing it around meaning. We're always trying to come back to meaning. And we don't want these things, even though they're hard, we don't want them to take over our lives, which they certainly can do. So I'm going to list out a few different bad end of things. So there's the good middle ground really with this. Some things, there's a fallacy called, it's the middle ground fallacy, or the fallacy of the middle, where people are like, oh, well, this must be the truth because it's in the middle of this argument. This is different. We're not talking about an argument. We're talking about how people function in the middle. In this case, the middle is good. It's good to have a certain level of anxiety or engagement, and it's good to have a certain level of calmness, right? You need to be in the middle of this. You want to be calm, but you want to be connected and you want to be alert at the same time. You don't want to be fearful. You don't want to be sleepy or anything like that. But I'm just going to talk about the bad end of things that can affect you or affect maybe people around you. So if you have sensory issues, if you are on the autism spectrum, you might have sensory issues where you can't deal with certain senses. You can't deal with certain stimuli in your environment, and it's a sensory overload, right? If you in some cases people freak out. It's typically the case if they are on the autism spectrum. I don't even know if this is a real mental illness or issue, but I know people who don't like chewing. They just hate chewing. They think it's the worst thing in the world, and they want to kill the people doing it. And that's just something that is breaking in. That's a sensory issue where they can't push aside that sense to deal with what they're doing. And of course, if you're dealing with a sensory issue, it's kind of like that overload, right? If you are somebody who can't deal with the senses, if you can't deal with sensory issues, if there's one thing, I know a kid who doesn't like beeping microwaves, so that's something that he deals with. But if that's one thing that really freaks you out, it's going into that kind of fight response, and there's probably more complexity to that, but it's easy to see how that fits into that model as well. If you're abused as a kid, you are going to probably deal with emotional issues, and emotional issues are also something that fit really into that into the anxiety aspect of things, because you're constantly going back and trying to deal with things. When you are abused as a child, whatever way you're abused, if you're abused or neglected as a child, when you're a kid, you develop your framework for how you're going to function in the world. And it helps, if you understand this, it helps you understand people who don't function the same way as you. So if you were beat as a child or you were neglected as a child, there's if you were abused, it's not necessarily beatings, right? You are going to probably say that you're probably going to have issues with maybe connecting to other people or connecting to certain types of authority figures or whatever. I don't know. But if you're beat as a child, there's going to be repercussions. If you're abused, maybe you're like, hey, I'm not really worthwhile at this. I'm not really a person who's worthwhile. Therefore, I'm just going to fade into the background. I'm not going to do anything. But you're developing that framework. If you're treated like, so this is happening today. If everything is pushed out, there's these parents nowadays that are called lawnmower parents. And what they do is they essentially lawn mow, they push out everything out of the way of their kids, so their kids have no issues, right? There was this report that there was a student in college who didn't know how to deal with sauces. She had been so sheltered from sauces all her life that she didn't know what to do, and food sauces, right? Sauces you put on stuff. She didn't know how to deal with it when she was at college. She had to go home, which is really sad, right? Her parents had pushed that out. So your parents developed this framework. If your parents always treat you like a little god, you're going to function in a way as if people should treat you that way. You learn in your childhood how you should function in the world, and which is why childhood is really important in how you treat kids, which is why it's important to actually give care and try to develop kids into well-balanced people. It's tough when you're not a perfect person yourself and you're trying to deal with stuff with children. So that your framework as a child, even if you're abused as an adult, that can happen as well. Trauma in childhood and adulthood can affect you, but childhood trauma, I think, it's going to stick with you more in most cases. Sleep disorders, like I mentioned earlier, alcohol or other drugs that can make you sleepy or make you really your brain go crazy. People who have bipolar disorder, you have depression, slows down your brain. You're going to think differently because of that depression. But mania isn't good. Mania is not a good thing, because mania, at the first stages, the mania seem great. And then mania can turn into irritability, and mania can turn into anxiety as well. It depends on the person as well. Other things are war. If you're in war, you're not safe. Therefore, you're gonna respond in a fear. You're gonna have a fear response to that. Poverty. This is if you grew up in poverty, you may buy into certain ideas that show you how you're gonna live the rest of your life. Right? You have that structure of, hey, this is how the world works, and this is what's gonna happen. Or if you always need to, if you never had enough, right? That's going to affect how you live and how you function as an adult or even as a teen as well. Homelessness, and there's a lot of other stuff that you can fit into that as well. Is this my right thing? So if you connect this to writing, or if you connect this to creativity or writing, you will have a hard time. You're going to have a hard time creating something if you're falling asleep, if you're on this side of things, right? If you are exhausted, you're going to have a hard time falling asleep. You run into this with a lot of kids with bad home lives. They just can't sleep for various reasons, or they're hungry. And because they can't sleep or they're hungry, they function at a lower level. They just can't focus because of the fact that they're too tired. Their brains can't physically focus on something. And if you don't have enough sleep, if you don't have enough food, you don't have enough of what you need to keep your body going. If you're starving, you're probably not going to do a lot of creative work. But if you might be able to, right? You can still. The crazy thing about humans is they can break out of the things that get in their way, right? These things, and they can push through them. It's very, very difficult to push through these things. This is why I'm talking about routine. They can push through them in a way that allows them to still do stuff. You still have people who do thinking when they go through pain. You still have people who can create when they're extremely tired. You still have people. There's the Hemingway quote, right? Drunk, edit, sober. But if you're drunk, your brain isn't actually. You're slowing down your brain when you're writing drunk. You're actually you're hindering your thinking process, which for some people, if you have a high level of anxiety, that might work, or it might just make you more anxious. If you're also going to have a hard time creating when you're anxious, right? If your brain is at capacity or close to capacity, there's not much room for creating. When your brain is at capacity, when you're worried about stuff, when you are that kid who was abused. When you're abused as a child and you grow up into an adult and you're like, you know what, this isn't worthwhile. You know, I've been told all my life that I'm crap, and I've been shown all my life that I'm crap because of being abused in specific ways. If you've been told that all your life, you're going to have worries about what's going on with what you're creating, and you're going to be saying, hey, you know what, this isn't worthwhile because I'm the one making it, and therefore, what's the point of doing it? And that's going to creep into what you're doing. And this can apply to different things as well. If you are in war, right, you have to deal with you're always hyper vigilant, probably, if you're out constantly in danger, unless you're unaware of it. And if you're in war, if you're in constant danger, or there's potentially constant danger, it's likely that your brain is going to focus on that danger. You're not going to have the brain capacity to focus on creating things. Here are some things, a different perspective. Here are broader categories of things that fight against productivity and creativity. Physical pain. Physical pain distracts you from what you're doing, okay? If someone is pinching your arm, if you get cut, if you get burned, I hate burns. I hate them so much. If you get burned, you're going to be focused on that small, little, or maybe large area of pain, right? If you get burned, you're constantly like, oh man, that hurts so badly. Oh man, you're constantly going back to that. You're constantly nursing that wound. And there's a reason for that. But when you're sitting down to write, you're constantly going back to that pain. You're constantly trying to deal with it. And it's going to make it more difficult. And these are, let me see. These are things that I would say are on your brain is engaged too much type of deal. Emotional pain is another one. Your brain is engaged too much with emotional pain because there is a threat to who you are as a person. It's not maybe a physical threat. Maybe you would consider it a physical threat. But if you have emotional pain in some way, emotional pain is, I think people do deal with heartbreak, and they do feel like physical pain, or your brain processes it in the same way as physical pain. So it's similar to that. And there's other distractions as well, different types of distractions such as yelling, television, interpersonal problems, and then other things that leave you too tired or worried to be engaged. Okay. So the main thing I'm talking about right now is that whether you're too tired or you don't have enough brain activity, right? You're too tired to do anything, or you're too worried or too fearful to do anything. But there's other things too that do one or the other thing. If I'm not tired, but I drink a lot of alcohol, I'm going to get a little snoozy. It's going to be harder to do stuff. That's why, in part, that's why I don't advocate writing when you're drinking, because if you write when you're drinking, you're probably not going to be as productive because you're not going to notice things as much. You're not going to be able to get into that flow. And then I would not, there's other things that I would not advocate talking to 3 different people or talking to even one person while you're writing, because that's going to distract you too much and you're not going to be able to be as productive. You're constantly going to be stopping. It's going to be harder to get into that flow. It's going to be harder to get into that middle ground. So it seems like on the face of it that when you deal with certain problems in your life, you just have to let the chips fall as they may. So if you're someone who has sensory issues, you just have to deal with it. You just have to push through it. Like I said before, you can push through difficulties and get stuff done. If you were abused as a kid, you have to push through all the physical and emotional trauma. If you have sleep deprivation, no, you just have to push through that sleep deprivation, etc. If you're living in poverty, there's this idea, just push through that poverty and you'll be fine. And there is a sense that you just have to deal with stuff and push forward. And if you keep on moving forward, you're going to be better off than if you didn't. But when you run into something that is difficult, there's often a way to do it there's ways to do it that are better than other ways. And maybe there's not one definitive way of doing it, but there are ways that are better than other ways. So to a certain degree, I would say, hey, deal with your problems and don't complain and push through your problems. But we don't just have to do that. It isn't true that you just have to keep on trying, and you're essentially banging your head into a brick wall until you break the wall down. That isn't how you have to do things. You could potentially be very successful when you do those things, but I think that we should take a perspective of, hey, how can we be creative about this? Because if you're a writer, you're likely creative. If you're a writer and you're not creative, you might be an extremely good writer. You just might happen to be touched by the ability to write, right? But if you're a writer and you're making fiction, you're probably creative. So think of your problem and then try to find creative solutions to your problem. And this is a solution that I think addresses this tiredness and anxiety or fear. I think it addresses both of these and helps you develop and be productive in a way that is going to be consistent. And that is routine. Okay. Routine, I think, is very important for being productive, and routine is, in a way, the fiber of productivity. So if you're not aware, fiber is a thing that you eat. Fiber is a part of vegetables and fruits and different types of foods. But if you, and we're going to get a little bit into your health, if you have constipation, eat fiber and it'll help. If you have diarrhea, eat fiber and it'll help. So routine is the fiber of productivity and creativity and living your life in a better way than just being in total fear or sitting on the couch all the time and watching TV. Routine helps your mind stay engaged and awake, and it also will help you deal with anxiety. So routine helps your mind stay awake. It'll teach you to have it'll help you develop a habit of staying awake at certain times. Your brain will get ready for specific types of activity, and just as your body adjusts to certain things as you develop, so will your mind, so will your brain, right? So for example, if you work out, your muscles will get bigger. If you have a specific routine, if you wake up at a certain time every day, you will get used to waking up at a certain time every day, and it'll be easier. If you are productive immediately in the morning and you are doing that consistently, it'll get easier to do that, right? It won't be difficult all the time. You are going to adjust to what's happening. So it's going to help you stay engaged because, for example, if you always have a time, and I've said this in the past, if you have a time that you write, it's the same time every single day. When you sit down and write after 2 weeks of doing that, it's going to be much easier. If you just sit down and write, it doesn't matter what you write. It's going to be easier to do that after 2 weeks than on the first day. Routine is also a safeguard against anxiety, and I'm not going to go into this a lot, but I'm going to give you 2 examples of routine and standardization, because that's really what we're doing, that helps with very stressful anxiety or fear-inducing situations. The first situation is if you're a paramedic or you're a medical professional that deals with emergency situations, right? These people go into an emergency situation where for a lot of people, they'd be freaking out. A lot of people would be freaking out. They wouldn't know what to do. Their brain would lock down in that. They'd probably lock down into either that hyper alert thing. They're just freaking out and moving around. They don't know what to do. Or maybe they would just slow down. They just shut down altogether. But people who are emergency professionals, who are paramedics or maybe a ER doctor or ER nurse, they have practiced doing the thing so much that when they run into those situations, they're like, okay, they stop themselves from the fear. They're like, all right, instead of going down this avenue of fear, I have another choice, and my other choice is to do what I've been trained to do. So your brain naturally goes down the avenue of fear or fight or flight, right? But if you can actually train your brain in those certain situations to be like, hey, there's another option, and if you start taking those steps, it'll allow you to continue down in that situation. Another area that this routine or standardization helps is war, right? If you have someone who is a soldier in war, they've trained to do certain things in high stress situations, and if they do those certain things in high stress situations, even though there's a danger to themselves, even though there is a danger to that person in that situation, they're much more likely to not freak out because they've trained so much. They've developed that habit. They can go back to that training and they can do what that training they can do what they learned in that training. So on one side, routine will help you be engaged at certain times, and on other times, routine will give you another option, right? If you have that routine, it'll be like, okay, so instead of worrying about this is what I do. If you are someone who has a very high level of anxiety, one thing I think you should do is you should have something that you do instead of worrying, right? You're like, okay, I'm worrying about this. What is one thing I can do about this situation? And do that one thing about the situation, even if it's very small. If you have that routine, it's going to help you in a lot of ways. Now let's get into writing in a little bit. So routine is like a structure for your life. And that routine helps you in those situations where you either don't have any motivation and you want to just sleep or watch TV, or it helps you in those situations where you are freaked out and you don't know what to do and you're worried, right? It helps you to be like, hey, I know what I do in this situation. I have the specific structure for living. Let's use that structure for living to get my life back on track. So when you are too tired, it's usually the case that's like, man, it's a type of disorder, really. If you're too tired, it's really like, oh, I don't want to do anything. I'm just going to do whatever that it makes me happy or makes me feel good, right? You are going to go to the thing that makes you the happiest, or makes you feel the best, gives you the most pleasure. So you're going to go toward those things. But with routine, it's going to give you a structure where you're like, hey, I can do fun things, or I can do things that allow me to have a rest, but I also am going to be productive at the same time. I'm not going to overload myself with things I'm doing to the point where I'm sick of them. And then if you're worried about stuff, what routine does is it takes all that worry and if you're worried about stuff and you're following your routine, first of all, it gives you some order to follow. It's like, hey, my life is under control, and all these other things, there's this big cloud of stuff that is that's just in disorder, but my life is under control. I know what I do every single day. I know what I do at this time of day. So routine can be very important in that respect, and it can pull you back. It can help you look. It can actually help you take a step back from that difficulty and look at that difficulty and try to find solutions to it. But grammar is kind of the routine of writing, and this isn't exactly what this whole thing is about. The whole thing is about routine, but grammar is about the routine of writing. Grammar is a structure we work within, and if we know how grammar works and if we know it well, we understand it really well, we can actually control how we are deviating from the grammar, right? So if we have a specific routine and we fit ourselves into that routine, or whatever type of routine it is, if we have an exercise regimen, if we have a diet, if we have whatever, if we have that structure, or we have a way we go about our whole day, if we have that structure and we've developed it, we can deviate from that structure without going crazy and off the rails and leading ourselves into destruction. In the same way with grammar, if you understand grammar, if you understand that structure that has been given to you, that is, and not just given to you, but it's embedded within language, it's a feature of language. If we understand that, we can actually deviate from that without destroying ourselves or destroying our story or whatever. The same thing applies to story structure and characters, right? If we understand story structure, we can understand how we can deviate from that story structure without destroying our narrative, without making it into something that's just a mess. We can do the same thing with characters. We can understand how characters work, within a story so that we can create certain characters and make our characters deviate from who they are. This is why it's important to know who your characters are at the core. Maybe not every little tiny thing, but if you know who your characters are at the core, you can develop them as you go along. You don't have to have every little detail worked out. You just know who they are. This all allows you to function in the middle ground better. It allows you to push into new areas without going off the rails, without getting too worried, without creating something that is really bad. And this routine, and maybe even in your writing as well, routine and understanding these structures can actually help you flip negatives into positive things. So for example, if you deal with a really difficult thing in your life and you have a really disordered life, well, you're dealing with the disorder of your life in some capacity, right? Either if you're just too lazy or not doing anything, or you're just too hypervigilant, you're dealing with a disorder in your life, and what's going on is you're trying to deal with all the disorder going on in your life, and you're also dealing with this bigger issue, or this issue that is central. So everything is in upheaval, and you're not able to focus on how to deal with that issue. So you are never going to get over it. But if you create order in your life, if you start creating a routine, then you're going to have that springboard, and you're going to be able to look at those issues in your lives from a broader perspective, because you're not just focused on, you don't have as much worry about those things, and you're going to be able to say, hey, this is a really good idea. I can take this, I can put it into my writing. But yeah, routine. So with routine, you don't really need you don't need a full routine right away. You really just need to start with something small. You just start with something small. You're like, I'm going to do this thing every single day at this time. And then you do that thing every single day at that time, and you get used to it. And then you have that one thing you can hold on to that you always do that. Maybe the one thing you do every single day is you wake up and you have a cup of coffee, and you do that every single day at the same time. And I think that the more structured your routine, where you have periods where you're productive and then periods where you rest, the better you're going to be able to do stuff. But it's not something you can just start doing immediately. It's something you really have to develop. But it is something that, for those of you who do have really big issues in your life, it's something that is going to give you a springboard for better dealing with those issues and being productive and creative in the face of those issues, right? You can push through with just pure grit and deal with those issues, but we want to be smarter than that. If you have a routine, and you can build routines around your own specific life, right? How your life works, the things you deal with. If you have family troubles, you can create things you do, right? You're like, if I have this situation in my family, I'm going to respond in this way. And it's going to help you deal with that thing, because you don't have to worry how you're going to respond. If you have a high level of anxiety, you can be like, when I'm feeling really anxious, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to go forward with stuff like that, or I'm going to do these steps. It's going to help you deal with them. But it's going to help you push through and deal with those things. And I think that it's something that can take those negative aspects of your life and actually turn it into a positive. Because instead of those things locking your brain up, you can look at those things and you can be like, okay, what is insight that I can get from those things? What is insight I can find in these things? What can I take from these things? What can I tell other people? How can I improve my life and the lives of others around me based on these issues or these things I deal with? And I think that's really cool. And I think that it's cool how you can actually take those negative things and turn them into a positive, which I think you can do. I totally think it's possible. And I think that it's just a requirement. I don't think anybody else can do it for you, actually. I think it's something that you just have to do it for yourself. And it's really a personal thing where you say, how can I improve my life? What are the little things I can do to improve my life? And that's it. And I think it's going to help with your productivity. And I think it's going to help with your creativity, your writing. I think it's going to help in all those areas when you actually have that structure. Congratulations, you got to the end of my podcast. So you either had to listen to my voice, or you had to listen to my voice and watch my face, which I don't envy you. Let's just say that. But if you're someone who likes this podcast and you're thinking, I'd like to support him in this podcast or the other creative things I'm doing, there's a few things you can do, because some people don't know what they can do to support people who create stuff. So these are the few things you can do that will really, really help me. First of all, check out my website. Check out the other things I'm doing. Second, comment on things, share them, like them, subscribe. Subscribe if you haven't already. And the third thing you can do is give reviews on different places, all right? So the biggest thing for this podcast is going on to iTunes, giving it an honest review, telling people why you like it, telling people why you hate my voice, why you hate my face, but telling people why they should really check it out, despite the fact that I have so many failings in terms of looks and voice. Other than that, if you want to check out my books, grab a copy of the book and listen to the serialized novel. Give digital copies away. That's a really big thing too. I always want to give you something that is valuable to you. I always want to give someone listening to this podcast something that's going to stick with them, or a book that they can actually own. And you can own that book for very, very cheap. So go check that out on Amazon. The different things I said: subscribe, upvote, comment, share, and definitely give it a review on iTunes. All right, as always, my name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good.
Three, four.